Hey everyone, first off let me apologize for using the crappy built-in microphone. I frighten relatively easily, as I've mentioned a few other times in the past on YouTube and other places, and I was just watching some horror stuff, and quite frankly, I'm afraid to go back to my room and get the good microphone right now, so sorry, you guys are just gonna have to put up with this. Hopefully when I go to review Defiance, everything will be fine. But anyway, let's get on with the review. This is another movie that's been getting a lot of hate from reviewers. I can kind of understand why, but personally I think a lot of the hate is unfounded. I think the big issue is that it was written by Frank Miller. I love Miller's comics, I love his writing, and I think the writing of this film is perfectly fine. This film plays out more like a literal interpretation of the phrase superhero movie or the phrase comic book movie, instead of a movie that just happens to be based on a comic book but keeps it in its own universe akin to our own. The Spirit is written like a comic book, complete with yellow thought bubbles. Well, okay, the thought bubbles don't actually appear on screen, but we get thought bubble style narration. Personally, I think this works fine, and it's kinda cool. But then, I am a huge comic book nerd, so those not in the comic book nerd demographic probably find it to be annoying. Visually, this movie is like a cross between Sin City and Dick Tracy. The latter half of that is probably adding to all the hate, though I fail to see why what a movie looks like should matter, so long as the cinematography is good, which it certainly is in this film. It shouldn't matter what the rest of the visuals look like. In the ways of complaints, I don't really have that many. I can think of one thing that comes to mind, and no, it's not the acting. I think all the acting was fine. Okay, sure. For some people like Samuel L. Jackson, it's certainly not their best work ever, but it's not so god-awful you want to tear your eyes out. My issue with this film stems somewhat out of the fact that this was written as a comic book movie. The early portions of the movie move a bit slow, and then after about 20 or so minutes, it picks up the pace and really gets moving. But then by the time you get to the end, you don't really think it's the end, and it feels like you haven't been sitting in the movie theater for the hour and a half that this movie is. The movie ends the way it does because, well, it is a literal comic book movie. It ends in comic book serial fashion. That's all fine and dandy, but in some ways it's kind of annoying. But the bigger issue from this writing and the comic book serial fashion is the pacing. The pacing of this movie just doesn't work. If this were a comic book, it would be some terrific pacing, it would be absolutely perfect, and another issue probably would be out by now, and there'd be another coming out in March or April. But for a movie, it's just terrible pacing. All in all, though, this film is fine. The flaws are few and mostly insignificant, and a good deal of them stem out of the fact that this was Frank Miller's first time running solo as both writer and director. So, we can hope and assume he will get better as time goes on. I give The Spirit 3 stars.